Hello, friends, and welcome back to Heartscapes, where we are learning the system of Reiki to be rooted, to be spacious, to be connected, and to remember ourselves. My name is Michaela. Welcome back to the studio. I'm really glad you're here. This is the final installment of a series of videos that I started a few weeks ago as part of my Ask Me Anything series. And these 6 videos in this particular section were responding to the question that I often get asked about the 5 elements of the system of Reiki from its Japanese origins. From those origins, there are 5 elements in the system. I'm often asked what those elements are, how they relate to each other, how they came to be, what their original context is, and so on. And so I decided to answer that question in a series of videos addressing, first of all, some of the overall context for the 5 elements, and then each of the elements in turn. This is the last of those videos, and so we are working with the 5th and final element in the system of Reiki, which is the Reiju. Now, in most of these other videos, and I'll link the playlist for the rest of them down below, I have addressed some version of the ways in which these elements have often been misunderstood or miscategorized inside of Western forms of the system. This is a result of the system of Reiki moving from Japan into the West in the United States during a particularly challenging period of history when Japan and the United States were in active conflict with each other in World War II. And all of the implications of that, the ramifications of that on the way in which this Japanese spiritual practice was taken into American culture. In all of the instances of these elements, in making that transition from its original form to Western forms, these elements and practices were either eliminated or their meanings were changed or misunderstood. Some of those changes were intentional. Others were just what happens when something leaves its original context, moves into a new context, and then is interpreted by people who live in that second space. And that is definitely true of the Reiju. So in this video, we're going to talk about what the Reiju truly is and means inside of its original context, how the ritual of the Reiju has changed and evolved over time as it moves into Western forms, how it now exists in most of Western Reiki, and why this is why we might want to rethink how we relate to it. And then I'll talk about where along this spectrum of change my practice lies, because the original form of Reiju is one that is very, very challenging to incorporate into our Reiki practices today. And so this is one of those instances where some of the modified concepts and understandings and rituals around this element actually do make more sense in a Western Reiki context, or even in just a modern American Reiki context, even if you, like me, are attempting to practice from the perspective of its origins. And where might be too far on that evolutionary spectrum, right? So I kind of tend to hang out at a particular place on this spectrum. I will share that with you. Okay, let's get into it. So the Reiju is the element that in Western Reiki is often called an attunement or an initiation. In its original Japanese, the word Reiju translates as spiritual blessing. Rei, R-E-I, the same Rei as in Reiki, is directly translated as spiritual or spirit or of the divine, and Ju is blessing. So this is a ritual of spiritual blessing. The attunement in Western Reiki is often taught and thought of in some variation of the following: that Reiki energy is universal life energy that exists out in the world, out in the universe. That we as humans generally do not have access to that Reiki energy. In other words, we can't intentionally call upon it to work with us to do healing or whatever it is we want to do with it, until we have been attuned to that energy by a teacher who was attuned by a teacher who was attuned by a teacher, etc., going back to the origins of the system with Mikao Usui. Now, I made another video recently about lineage and about why our Reiki lineage of teachers does, and in some cases does not matter with respect to our Reiki practice. And in that video, I talk a bit about the Reiju and the misunderstanding of passing the Reiju along a lineage. I'll link that down below as well. It's actually in the same playlist as these Ask Me Anythings. So we have this perception that you and I exist in a world that has Reiki energy, that has universal life energy, but we cannot access it until we have been attuned to it by somebody who's in a lineage going back to Mikao Usui, who was originally gifted or granted the ability to work with Reiki through a spiritual process. And that once you are attuned to Reiki, there's not a whole lot more you need to do in order to become a channel for that energy to move through you and into somebody else and to share a Reiki session with them. In other words, and this is something that I'm generalizing about because teachers will have very different, wide range of ways in which they understand and teach these concepts. I'm kind of speaking of the kind of extreme form of this misunderstanding as I'm generalizing in this way. But I have definitely been taught by certain teachers that once you are attuned to Reiki, if you lay your hands on a person and set the intention that Reiki is going to flow to them, then it will flow. And you don't have to do anything else about that. Your mind can wander. You can be focused on something else. You can be watching television. You can be doing anything else. You've turned on the switch and Reiki energy is flowing. And you can do that because you have been attuned. Now, this way of orienting to Reiki, to attunement or to Reiju, and to the understanding of what's actually happening in an exchange is not from the original. This is not accurate to how the people who developed this system of practice out of long-standing pre-existing systems of esoteric spiritual practice in Japan. This is not the understanding that they had. On the contrary, Reiki, from those perspectives, is inherently who and what we are. That you are Reiki, spiritual energy. It's what animates you, what connects you to the web of life, what interconnects your life force with all other life forces. It is something that steps outside of the physical and binds us together, interconnects us together in a non-dualistic space where all things exist and therefore nothing exists in a beautiful Zen paradox. And so you already are Reiki. You already have Reiki. You do not need me or anybody else to give it to you. So, what is the Reiju? And what is the system of Reiki for, if not to give us access to Reiki? Well, it's to help us to remember. It's to help us to remember on a physical, emotional, mental, energetic level that we are the great bright light of spiritual energy. That at our core, in our essence, we are this great, bright, clear, luminous light that is interconnected with the life force of everything else. That we go through our lives with distractions, with pains, with challenges that distract us and cause us to forget this truth. And so we need a system of practice to help us refocus our attention on this truth, to remember it, to have a visceral, felt, embodied experience of this truth so that we can live our lives in alignment with this truth, essentially as an enlightened person. And this is very challenging because there is so many layers of distraction that we have built up. And so we have a system of practice with 5 elements that gives us pathways to slowly do this work of uncovering our bright light and remembering that we are interconnected with all life, with all resources in the world, that we are not separate, we are not distinguished, we are not our ego, that we are in fact life. So what role does the Reiju play inside of this system? The Reiju, or spiritual blessing, is a ritual of remembering. It is an opportunity for a teacher and a student, or people who are practicing together, to go into an energetic space where we drop those distractions, where we connect deeply with that great bright light. We have an initial experience of our true self. And every time we do it, it is an initial experience because we're different every time we come to it. We put ourselves in a frame of mind that releases our attachment to our ego, that opens up the possibility of a non-dualistic space where everything gets to exist and have plenty of room inside of ourselves. And Usui Sensei, Mikao Usui, who was the first to teach this particular system of practice, would conduct this ritual, this Reiju, with his students with absolutely no physical ritual at all. It was a ritual in the sense that it was a set of actions that caused us to pause and focus our attention on a specific intention, to drop our ego, to be in a non-dualistic space, to feel our interconnection with all life and with the people that we're sharing that moment with, and to simply be the great bright light that we are without any other attachments. Now, that's a whole lot of pretty words. That can be really, really hard to conceptualize, let alone to actually enact. And so Usui Sensei, who had spent a lifetime in deep esoteric practice and had a lifetime of experience with bringing his mind, focusing his mind in the way that I just described, so that he could drop into that and he could simply be with his students without doing anything in this way that brought that mindset into the space. And that in that connected space, his students could have an initial experience of their great bright light, of their true self. They could have a moment of remembering that they are interconnected in a non-dual space with all of life. And that is the Reiju. It's this moment of remembering an initial experience with our true self. Now, as I just said, this can be incredibly challenging. It is an advanced practice. I want to read a little bit from The Inner Heart of Reiki, written by one of my teachers, Franz Stina. And in reflecting on this original form of Reiju and comparing it to we as modern practitioners who do not, in most cases, certainly not in my case, have a lifetime of deeply entrenched esoteric Japanese practice. And he says in reflection to that, unfortunately, few modern Reiki teachers are able to facilitate the egoless mind-to-mind transmission that is the foundation of Reiju. Many might even find it hard to understand the concepts, let alone to be a great bright light. It is extremely difficult to completely step out of the way. Our ego has such a strong grip on everything. This is why the system of Reiki is a spiritual and a lifelong practice. And so what to do if you're Mikao Usui and you have this capacity that you do not see in most of the people that you work with, and yet you want to be able to transmit this system of practice to others and allow them to transmit it to others so that more and more people can benefit. Well, what he did was he brought in elements of pre-existing rituals, again, from the esoteric traditions that he would have followed, which included Shingon Buddhism, which included Shugendo, which is the ascetic mountain traditions of Japan, and it included, of course, the indigenous practices of Shinto. And from those traditions, there are a wide range of rituals that include physical components, actions, points of focus that help the person to focus their mind on the intention of the ritual. I just taught a class this morning on the art of spontaneous ritual, and we talked a lot about, really what ritual does for us, that it creates a container that helps us to focus our attention on what has meaning in this moment, call us back from all of the distractions, and really set an intention to be in this moment, to be responsive to whatever is happening in this moment that has meaning, that is important. We talked a lot about a lot of other things as well, but I think for this purpose, when we think about Reiju as a ritual, that's really what we're doing. We're creating a container where we can fully focus our mind on the intention to be the great bright light that we are, to remember our inherent interconnectedness, and to step into a space of non-dualistic, egoless presence. And so the first variation of that Reiju included a series of hand positions that were borrowed from a ritual called Kaji that was present in these esoteric traditions. Simple series of hand positions that are gestures to different parts of the body, from the teacher to the student. And that, again, allows you to focus your mind on the intentions that are inherent in this ritual. And that was very helpful for helping others to step into this practice of Reiju, who may not be able to simply be in that space without a point of focus. When the system of Reiki was then passed to some of his students, there was an introduction of symbols and mantras into the system. We talked about symbols and mantras in a previous video in this series, and I'm not even sure if I mentioned in that video, can't remember, that the symbols and mantras were actually added to the system by Mikao Usui's students, not by Usui himself. And they were added in completely in alignment with the intentions of the system. But again, out of this recognition that there are going to be many people who have not spent their lifetime in these types of practices, that the purpose of the system of Reiki is to create something that's accessible to a wider range of people. And therefore, people are going to need different forms of points of focus to help call back our attention from all of the distractions of life and be fully present in our practice. And that people have different ways of learning, different ways of paying attention. And so we want to have elements that involve the physical body. So hand positions from Tenohira, from the palm healing aspect. We want to have symbols that are visual points of focus. We want to have mantras that are auditory points of focus and that allow us to use our voice and the vibrations inside of our bodies. And we want to have contemplative points of focus, so working with the words of the precepts. And inside of the Reiju, different teachers would bring in these different elements into the ritual of Reiju, again, as a point of focus. So in the form of Reiju that I practice and that I teach to my Shimpuren Reiki 3 students, we learn 3 different variations. We learn about the original form, where you're simply being the great bright light. I still struggle with this form. I am not going to claim that I am at a point where, at a moment's notice, when needed in a class or in a experience with a student, that I am able to fully drop into that space without the support of points of focus. And so we teach 2 other forms. That first original form that Mikao Usui developed, simply using a series of hand positions, and a little bit more complex form that incorporates in symbols and mantras and a few other gestures and hand positions, again, specifically as points of focus for the practitioner to help us to call our mind back from all of the distractions, and as much as possible, facilitate for ourselves and for those we are working with a direct experience of their true self, their true, whole, embodied, bright light. So that is where I live with the Reiju, as a ritual of connection, of focusing our attention on what is most needed by each individual person, where they are in their practice, to have an initial experience of themselves as a great bright light, as their true and whole self. In any given moment, on any given day, we will all be in a different point of relationship to our practice, to that experience, And the Reiju is a ritual that meets us exactly where we are and gives us a moment to open ourselves to what we most need in that moment for our own practice, our own growth, our own trajectory. And it's very powerful for doing that, right? Because it truly has all of these layers that focus our attention, which is the most powerful part of our practice. What it does not do is flip some sort of switch inside of myself or others that grants access to Reiki energy that did not previously exist. You already have access to Reiki energy. It's what you are. It's what animates you and connects you to the web of life. You do not need a Reiju or anything else to make that true. But you may benefit greatly from a system of practice that helps you focus your attention on that. Remember those facts. Uncover that direct experience within yourself, little by little over time, or in great flashes of insight that can come in a moment. And that's what the system of Reiki does for us. It gives us a structure for remembering our true self and all of the incredible impacts on our life that happen when we live our life that way. So that is the Reiju. I mentioned that spectrum and kind of where I recommend we hang out. And I'm going to recommend we hang out right there at the place I just described, where we're allowing ourselves to use whatever level of ritual we need in that moment to focus our mind. But we remember that that is what the ritual is for. It's to help us to focus our mind on a truth that already exists. It is not there to turn Reiki on in ourselves or others. It's not there to give access to it. And once it has been accomplished, it's not the end of the practice, because mastery does not come from Reiju, from attunement, from initiation. Mastery comes from practice. We don't get there any other way. It comes from practice, and the Reiju is part of that practice, a significant part of the practice, but it's not the one that gives Reiki to you. You already have that. Okay. I think that is what I want to share about the beautiful ritual of Reiju. I welcome your questions and comments, your reflections. If you have experienced a Reiju, or have you experienced a Reiki teacher sharing what they called an attunement, I'd love to hear your experiences with that. If you have any other questions about practicing the system of Reiki from its Japanese origins, about incorporating the system of Reiki into your day-to-day life, I would love to answer them on a future video. So you can drop those down in the comments. You can use the hashtag AskHeartscapes, and that'll help me find them. Either way, I'll find them. I'll answer them in a future video. And I thank you for that input. And wherever you travel from here, in your day, in your week, may you be deeply provisioned for that journey. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time, I love you. Goodbye.